In 120 pages, you can learn a lot about Newton's legendary people. Legendary Locals of Newton, written by Gail Spector, a former editor for the Newton Tab, has compiled a long list of individuals who have helped create and who continue to mold Newton. Joining me in the studio to discuss her new book and what it took to write it is Gail Spector. Gail, thanks so much for joining me, and congratulations on finishing the book.
Thank you very much.
So how did you come up with a list of all these people? Like, where did you start?
Coming up with a list actually was the easy part of writing this book. It was, Newton is filled with amazing people who've done incredible things. There are Nobel Prize winners, there are authors, there are artists, there are athletes. I mean, it's just, there are so many people. Having been a journalist in Newton for 12 years or so, I knew a lot about the city, and I knew, so I knew a lot about the history of the city, and I had a good idea of where to start. Historic Newton was very helpful. I didn't have to just come up with people, I had to come up with images, because the book is a collection of profiles and images. Each person has an image to go along with it. I started with Historic Newton, and they were very helpful in giving me information, and they just have a wealth of information both at the museum and online, and I got images from them. I use the media to help me ask people for suggestions, and I used Village 14, the blog that I'm a part of, to help solicit ideas, and people gave me tons of ideas of people to include, and one suggestion would lead to another. I'd talk to somebody and it would lead to another idea, and there was no shortage of people to include. There was just shortage of space. There wasn't enough room to include everybody I wanted to include.
I bet. I mean, do you have enough people now, left over to perhaps create a second book?
There are definitely enough to create a second book. I mean, there are many people I would have liked to include who I could not include.
So how did you decide who was in and who was out?
I wanted a pretty even representation of categories. The book is broken into chapters. There's a chapter of artists, and there's history, there's athletes, there's business, there's religion. So I wanted to break it up that way. And Arcadia Publishing, the publisher of the book, gave me a little bit of a charge about, the mission was a little bit, don't have too many that are way back, so it was divided up. It was divided a little bit that way. So I had a little bit of guideline from them, and some of it was just what felt right.
What felt right.
Yeah. How
did you take all of this information that each individual has and condense it to a paragraph, or some have a couple of pages, others have just this short paragraph that.
That wasn't easy, but I'm
an editor, right? Which came in handy, I'm sure.
It absolutely did. Some of them, my maximum amount of words was 400, yet I could only have something like 40 people who I could give 400 words to. So my minimum words per person was 40, and it wasn't easy to limit somebody to 40 words.
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you take somebody who's done an amazing thing with their life and limit them to 40 words? I mean, that was very difficult. But, I edited the Newton Tab for 5.5 years. I edited people's writing, so it's one of my skills, and I put it to good use on my own writing.
Now, I read somewhere that you kind of snuck some people in, and like the introductions, or where you could mention their names without giving a whole long list or the 40 words.
Yeah, it was my way of cheating. For each chapter has an introduction, and if I couldn't find a picture of somebody, for example, like there were people I couldn't put in because I couldn't find their photo. So in a chapter introduction, or I didn't put them in because I just didn't have enough space for them. So in a chapter introduction, I might have mentioned that this person, somebody who comes to mind is Russell Pergament, who was the founder of the Tab newspapers. I know that I mentioned him in the chapter that includes the media. somebody who I actually don't remember if I included him in a chapter introduction, but somebody I know I wanted to put in was Charlie Feely, a police sergeant who, from the stories that were told, he must have taught every child in this city how to ride their bike how to ride his bike safely for decades. 'Cause so many people mentioned him, but I couldn't find a photo.
Right.
I'm guessing that I've snuck him into I must have snuck him into a chapter introduction because so many people talked about him.
So what were your favorite stories? I mean, you've talked about quite a few people here, so which ones, I guess, were your most favorite?
I think my absolute favorite story was Louise Bruin, who she still lives in the community. She was a housewife, a mom, a dance teacher in the early 70s, 1971, I believe it was, and she was outraged by the Vietnam War and was convinced that people had become anesthetized to it. She had read the New York Times, I believe it was, one morning and was so upset by it that she decided she had to do something. And 11 days later, she put a backpack on and marched out her door and walked 450 miles to Washington, D.C. to protest the war. She had a lot of support from her friends in Newton, and they had drafted a petition and gathered signatures and arranged places to stay along the way, and there were people who met her along the way and walked with her and told her their stories, and she gathered signatures along the way, and her story was amazing. And I sat with her in her living room and she showed me her clips, and she had a big scrapbook, and she got teary-eyed telling me the story. And it was, so 40-something years later, it still touched her, and it still meant so much to her. And and she was doing this. She was going to Washington to talk to President Nixon to tell him to stop the war.
Right.
And she did not talk to President Nixon, but Senator Kennedy and Congressman Drinan met her at the steps of the Capitol, and as did a lot of other people and a lot of press. And
wow.
And it was, I had vaguely heard about this story before, but I hadn't heard her tell. I hadn't met her. I hadn't heard her tell the story, and it was such a powerful story, and that somebody would just do something and not think of all the reasons why not to do it, and would do it so fast. And
just pick up and go.
Yeah,
amazing.
It was just, she had teenagers at home, and it was an incredible story. It really, really touched me, and it was.
It sounds amazing. I know she wrote a book as well.
She did.
Yeah.
Yes. She walked for all of us.
I think that's it. Yes, I actually have it in my office.
Yeah.
So that's your favorite, but what did you learn along the way? You must have learned a lot.
I learned a ton along the way. I thought I knew a lot about Newton, and I did, and I learned a lot more about Newton. One of the things that really struck me was how deep the passion ran in the roots of Newton. In hindsight, it makes sense, but when I read about some of the passionate discussions that were taking place in the mid-1800s in like West Newton and the homes of Horace Mann and Nathaniel Allen, and they were discussing and very passionately about abolition and public education, and and not just Horace Mann and Nathaniel Allen, but their wives and different people, and it reminded me of Newton now, and yet it was all those years ago, right. And it seemed like this is what Newton is now, yet this is what Newton was then, and I could see. I could see where that came from. Like I saw this, I could feel the connection between Newton now and Newton then. And it was powerful. It was a very powerful thing. Like it's like this. It was the same discussions that are taking place. We're not talking about abolition,
Right.
or temperance, but well, we're talking about legalization of marijuana now.
Right.
But
Different
we're having
subject,
these
but-
same
right.
conversations on the blogs now, and it's the same passion and the same fervor, and it was really cool.
That
It
is
was-
kind of neat.
so-
100, 200 years later, and we still have that passion here.
Yeah,
Which is
so-
definitely nice to see.
Yeah, it was a very cool thing.
So your book is out now, but you're having a reception for it at Newtonville Books.
Yes, we're having a book release party at Newtonville Books on Wednesday, April 29th at 7 p.m. So
And
I'm
everyone's, of
very
course,
excited about that.
I bet. I
Um,
mean, now that the book is done, which I'm guessing took a little while to
it
do.
did take a while.
Definitely a well-deserved celebration, and of course, everyone is invited.
Everyone is invited. I'm very much looking forward to celebrating it with everyone.
Well, Gail, thanks so much. The book is a wonderful read and very interesting.
Thank you.
And
Thanks very much.
everyone should pick it up, at least.
I certainly hope they will. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. The book, Legendary Locals of Newton, is out now, and you can meet the author, Gail Spector, on April 29th at 7 p.m. at Newtonville Books.